The German officer stood at the edge of a collapsed farmhouse wall, binoculars in hand, watching a prepared defensive line die in real time. His regiment had spent 4 days on that ridge. They had dug the gun pits by hand. They had zeroed the artillery. They had mapped every approach, every blind spot, every axis of advance the Americans might use. The officers had done everything right. The manuals said this position was strong. The manuals were wrong. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts dropped out of a low overcast and hit the ridge in sequence. Not randomly, not searching. They hit the exact coordinates of positions that were not visible from the air. They hit the gun pits first, then the ammunition store, then the command post. 11 minutes from the first pass to the last. The regiment was done. The German officer wrote in his field notes that evening, "This cannot be reconnaissance." They knew. He was right. They did know. And that is the story this episode is actually about. How was this possible? The ridge positions were camouflaged. The Germans had moved at night. They had observed radio silence on approach. Every standard precaution for avoiding air observation had been followed. By any reasonable calculation, those aircraft should have been searching. They should have been guessing. They should have wasted passes on empty ground. Instead, they arrived with a map in hand. How do you build a defensive line that an enemy pilot can already see before he takes off? How does a fighter bomber, operating at 300 miles an hour, hit a gun pit that was dug less than 48 hours earlier? The answer is not superior reconnaissance aircraft. It is not satellite imagery. It is not sorcery. It is a small card, a radio, and a man lying in the mud 400 yards from the front line. If you've ever been interested in stories about how the other side realized something was wrong, and realized it too late, this is one of those stories. Normandy, France. Late July, 1944. A man named Lawson was lying on his stomach in a drainage ditch outside a shattered village, the maps called Marigny. He was 38 years old, which made him older than most of the men around him. He wore no insignia that advertised his role. He carried a radio the size of a large briefcase, an SCR 522 set, and a clipboard with a grease pencil map overlay pressed against a board that was already warped from the rain. He had been in the ditch for 6 hours. 200 yards ahead of him, a German 88mm anti-tank gun was dug into a tree line. He knew the exact bearing. He knew the approximate depth of the gun pit. He knew there were at least 2 more positions flanking it, because he had watched the muzzle flashes the night before and paced off the angles in the dark. He had all of this on his card. He called the flight lead on the radio. He gave grid. He gave bearing. He gave the offset, the distance and direction from his own position to the target, so the pilot would not drop short. He gave the cardinal direction of his own approach for deconfliction. He gave the recommended attack axis to avoid the ridge on egress. The whole transmission took less than 40 seconds. 12 minutes later, a flight of 4 Thunderbolts came in from the southwest. They hit the 88 on the first pass. They hit both flanking positions on the second. They were gone before the German artillery could respond. Lawson crossed the position off his card and moved forward. That is what the German officer could not explain. Not the aircraft. Not the bombs. The man in the drainage ditch who already knew where to look. I think this is the part most people still get wrong about Allied air power in 1944. It was not just about having more aircraft. It was about having a man on the ground who could close the loop in under a minute. Without that man, the aircraft were just noise. With him, they were a precision instrument. The machine did not exist without the individual at the sharp end. The German doctrine of 1944 was built on a specific assumption about air power. That assumption was not unreasonable, given what air power had actually delivered in the first years of the war. The assumption was this: fighter bombers are good at hitting big, visible, moving targets. Columns on roads, bridges, supply depots, rail yards, things that stand out from altitude, things that do not require ground-level observation to find. Against prepared, camouflaged static defenses, the kind the Wehrmacht was exceptionally good at building. The assumption was that fighter bombers would struggle. They would waste ordnance on false positions. They would break off in bad weather. They would attack the front of the line where defenders expected them, not the interior where the real assets were hidden. This assumption had held during the initial fighting in Normandy. In June and into early July, the bocage terrain, the dense hedgerows, the sunken lanes, the compartmentalized fields, genuinely degraded air effectiveness. Pilots could not see anything. Ground controllers had too little radio coverage. The coordination net was incomplete. German commanders had watched this and concluded something dangerous. That their defensive method worked. That as long as you dug in fast, moved at night, and kept radio emissions low, the American aircraft were manageable. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, in post-war interviews conducted by military historian Basil Little-Hart, described the Allied fighter-bomber threat as serious, but assumed it was constrained by the same information problem that had always plagued air support. The aircraft simply could not see well enough to kill what was well hidden. He was wrong, but he was wrong for a specific reason, and that reason was not obvious until it was too late. The Americans had not just added more aircraft. They had added a system to see through the camouflage, and that system was built on radio, not cameras. The organization that changed the equation was the XIX Tactical Air Command, commanded by Brigadier General Otto P. Weyland. Weyland's command existed on paper before Cobra, but what made it function as a weapon was the partnership it built with General George Patton's Third Army, and the specific doctrine that partnership produced in the weeks before the breakout. The doctrine was called Armored Column Cover. It worked like this. When an armored unit was moving or in contact, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, typically 4 aircraft, was assigned to orbit overhead at medium altitude. They were not searching randomly. They were attached, like a cavalry screen, to that column. They stayed on station until their fuel required them to return, at which point a relief flight took over. The orbit was continuous. Below, embedded with the armored unit, was a forward air controller, not a liaison officer sitting in a tent looking at maps. A man moving with the lead elements, in a vehicle or on foot, with a radio tuned to the aircraft frequency and a direct line to the ground tactical commander. When contact was made, when a gun opened up, when movement was spotted, when a position was identified, the FAC had seconds to call it in. He gave the pilot a description: bearing, distance, landmark, offset. The pilot rolled in. The pilot confirmed the target visually, or the FAC talked him onto it with corrections. Then the strike went in. From first contact to first bomb, the time was measured in minutes, sometimes less. The German defensive equation had never accounted for a loop that short. It assumed there would be time to relocate, time to set up alternative positions, time to wait out the air threat while the aircraft ran out of fuel and went home. That time no longer existed. The system worked because of 3 components that had to function together. First, a radio net that actually reached from ground to air. The SCR-522 was not a perfect radio. It was heavy. It broke down in the mud. It needed line of sight to function reliably. But it was good enough, and the controllers who operated it learned to use terrain to their advantage. Second, a doctrine that trusted the controller's judgment. In earlier Allied air support arrangements, a ground request for air support passed through multiple headquarters before it was approved and relayed. That process took hours. The Armored Column Cover system gave the FAC the authority to call a strike directly, without waiting for approval from above. The pilot and the controller were equals in the transaction. Third, P-47, Thunderbolts configured for ground attack. The Thunderbolt was a large, heavy aircraft. It absorbed punishment in a way that lighter fighters could not. It could carry a mix of bombs and rockets that gave the pilot flexibility. If a position was hardened, he could use rockets for penetration. If it was a soft-skinned vehicle or a gun crew in the open, he could use a lower altitude strafing pass. The aircraft could do multiple things, and the controller could specify what the situation required. All three components had to work. If the radio failed, the aircraft orbited uselessly and eventually went home. If the controller was too far forward, he was killed before he could call. If the doctrine required headquarters approval, the opportunity was gone before the approval arrived. Weyland's command got all three right, at the same time, in the same place, at scale. By the third week of July, the German commanders in Normandy were writing things in their situation reports that had no precedent in German military history. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most experienced and well-equipped armored formations in the German army. He had fought in North Africa. He had fought in Italy. He had fought in Russia. He knew what air attack looked like. He knew how to survive it. After Operation Cobra, the American breakout that began on July 25, 1944, Bayerlein described the condition of his division in testimony that later became part of the historical record. He did not use the language of temporary setback. He used the language of destruction. His division, he said, was effectively gone. Not pushed back. Not weakened. Gone. The positions his men had prepared, the gun pits they had registered, the command posts they had carefully concealed. All of it hit within hours of the breakout beginning. He later described the area his division had defended as looking like a field of corpses. What Bayerlein could not explain, what multiple German after-action reports from this period cannot explain, was the specificity of the strikes. The Americans had not carpet-bombed the area and destroyed everything, including empty ground. They had hit particular points that were, from the air, invisible. His reports from this period are consistent with other German unit accounts from the same campaign, a pattern of strikes that suggested the Americans could see through camouflage, could locate a gun position from the sound of a single shot, could find a command post that had no visible signature. Records from interrogations of German officers captured during the Cobra breakout, collected by U.S. Army intelligence, reflect the same bewilderment. The interrogation reports note, repeatedly, that captured officers identified American air coordination as a factor they had no answer for. Not the number of aircraft, the speed and accuracy of the strikes. One interrogation record, preserved in U.S. Army archives, noted that a captured battalion commander stated, through an interpreter, that his unit had been hit 4 times in a single day, and that each time they relocated, the aircraft found them within hours. He had concluded that the Americans must have agents inside the German lines. He was wrong about the agents, but the conclusion was understandable. What was happening to him did not fit any model of air attack he had encountered before. The men who made the system work are not in the history books, not most of them. There were, in the 19th TAC sector alone, hundreds of personnel whose entire function was to manage the radio nets, the mission boards, the frequencies, the flight rotations, the refueling and rearming cycles that kept aircraft on station. There were mechanics at the forward airfields in Normandy who worked in shifts so that the aircraft that landed at noon were back in the air by 2 in the afternoon. There were radio operators in the armored half-tracks who maintained frequency discipline across multiple nets simultaneously. Air, artillery, and armor on different sets, different channels, with different call signs, all at the same time, often under fire. And there were the forward air controllers themselves, men who lived forward, men who had to be close enough to see the target, which meant close enough to be seen themselves. Men who had to maintain calm on the radio while the situation around them was anything but calm. Men who had to give accurate grid references while lying in a ditch, while the ground was moving from shell impacts, while the armored unit they were attached to was in active contact. The FAC who called the strike did not fire the gun. He was not the one who pulled the trigger, released the bomb, or flew the aircraft. But without his judgment, his training, his ability to read terrain, and translate a ground picture into a set of coordinates that a pilot 3,000 feet overhead could act on. None of the rest of it worked. When the thunderbolts came in and hit a position the German officer was certain no one could see, they were following instructions prepared by a man on the ground. A man who had crawled to a spot that gave him line of sight. A man who had counted the seconds between the muzzle flash and the sound to estimate distance. A man who had memorized the attack axis because one specific ridge would create a dangerous pull-up if the pilot went in from the wrong direction. That man was never in the headline. The headline said the aircraft destroyed the position. The aircraft delivered the ordnance. The man told the aircraft where to go. The system came very close to breaking at least twice in the Cobra period, and the reasons it nearly broke illuminate exactly how fragile the architecture actually was. The first near failure was weather. The original date for Operation Cobra was July 24th. The strikes went in on July 24th. But the weather was worse than predicted. Low cloud, poor visibility. Some aircraft released early due to navigational confusion. Some ordnance fell short. American troops were killed by their own aircraft in the resulting confusion. A catastrophic outcome that threatened the entire concept of close air support at short range. The inquiry that followed was immediate and brutal. The Tactical Air Command was not disbanded, but the pressure to modify procedures, to increase the safety margin between bomb lines and forward troops, to require more conservative attack profiles, all of that pressure was real. If it had one, the tight coordination loop that made the system dangerous to the Germans would have been widened until it was no longer tight enough to matter. It did not win, but it came close. The second near failure was radio. The SCR 522 sets that the FACs carried were not designed for the role they were performing. They were aircraft radios, adapted for ground use. In the mud and rain of Normandy, they failed regularly. Moisture got into the units. Batteries ran down faster than anticipated. Crystals, the frequency selection components, failed or were lost. A controller with a dead radio was a controller who could not close the loop. He was a man lying in a drainage ditch with a clipboard and nowhere to send the information. In the weeks before Cobra, there had been multiple instances where FACs had lost communication with the orbiting flight, and the aircraft had eventually departed without striking anything. The system depended on a radio that broke. The men who operated those radios knew this. They carried spare parts in their pockets. They dried the units out with body heat at night. They switched to backup frequencies when primary frequencies were blocked or jammed. This is the uncomfortable part of the story. The architecture that German commanders could not counter was held together in multiple places by improvisation. By a man drying a crystal with his shirt. By a controller who shifted to a secondary frequency without being ordered to. By a mechanic at the forward strip who found a way to turn around an aircraft in 40 minutes instead of 90. The system worked, but it worked partly because of the people inside it who refused to let it not work. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. The heavy bombers went first. A carpet of ordnance designed to crack open the crust of the German line along the Perrier-Saint-Lô highway. Then, the ground forces moved. And above them, continuously, the P-47s of the XIX Tactical Air Command orbited in their cab rank pattern, one flight relieving the next, the radios open. The armored columns moved faster than any previous breakout in the campaign. The German line, which should have been capable of slowing an advance for days, collapsed in hours. Units that had prepared strong points in depth found that the strong points were hit before the ground troops arrived. The timing defied explanation from the German perspective. What the German commanders saw was this: their artillery could not survive long enough to range the advancing columns. Every time a gun opened fire, it was identified by the controller who heard it, calculated the bearing, gave the grid, and struck within minutes. To relocate took time. To register the new position took more time. Before the gun could fire a second effective round from the new position, the aircraft were already inbound. The Panzer Lehr Division, which Bayerlein commanded, was positioned directly in the path of the breakout. It had approximately 200 tanks and armored vehicles when Cobra began. By the end of the first day, German records indicate it had fewer than 15 vehicles still operational. The division had not been outflanked. It had been struck from above while it sat in positions its commanders believed were protected. Bayerlein's post-war account, recorded by Little Hart, includes a passage describing German tank crews refusing to emerge from their vehicles to fight because they believed the sound of the engine would bring aircraft within minutes. He was not exaggerating for effect. German tank crews had learned, empirically, through casualties, that motion or sound in the open was detected, reported, and struck at a speed they could not respond to. The German ability to mount a prepared defense had not been outfought by a better division. It had been made irrelevant by a faster decision loop. A colonel who coordinates a defense over 4 days of preparation cannot compete with a system that can find, fix, and strike a position in 8 minutes. The arithmetic of defense, the assumption that a prepared position multiplies the strength of the defender, had a hidden variable that German doctrine did not account for. It assumed the attacker needed time to find the position. When that assumption was removed, the arithmetic collapsed. The numbers from the Cobra breakout and the subsequent advance of Third Army tell the story at scale. In the 6 weeks following Cobra, from late July through early September 1944, Third Army advanced approximately 500 miles. That pace was unprecedented in the Western Theater. It depended on the German inability to form a coherent defense. And the German inability to form a coherent defense depended in large part on the air coordination system destroying positions faster than they could be prepared. The XIX Tactical Air Command flew an estimated 12,000 sorties in direct support of ground operations during this period. The sortie number is large. What matters more is the response time. Multiple American after-action reports from armored unit commanders note that they expected air support to arrive within 10 to 15 minutes of a radio request. In many cases, because the orbiting flights were already in the area, the response was shorter. German armor losses attributed directly to air attack during this period are difficult to isolate with precision. Post-battle attribution is always complicated, but the German after-action assessments consistently identify air attack as the primary operational constraint on their defensive planning. Not the Sherman tank, not American artillery, the aircraft they could not predict, and the ground controllers they could not find. Von Rundstedt, in post-war testimony, was asked what Germany should have done differently. He named several factors. Near the top of the list was the Allied air coordination net. He described it, and this is consistent across multiple German accounts from this period, as something that made daylight movement of any significant force effectively impossible. The German army in France in the summer of 1944 was an army that could only move at night, and even at night, the controllers who had observed movement during the day had marked the routes on their cards. By the time the German command structure recognized what was happening, not air attack in general, but this specific coordinated system, Third Army was already through the gap. The realization came too late to be useful. There is a bitter irony worth sitting with here. The German military had pioneered the integration of air and ground forces earlier in the war. The Stuka's role in Blitzkrieg, the close coordination between Luftwaffe and panzer units. Germany had understood the concept before anyone else. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer had the assets to contest the air. And the Americans had taken the concept, refined it, miniaturized the control mechanism down to one man with a radio, and made it so fast that it operated inside the German command cycle. Germany had taught the world what integrated air-ground operations looked like. America had made it faster than Germany could respond to. The forward air controllers who flew missions on the ground, that is not a typo. They were pilots who chose to operate on the ground, are not prominent in the popular history of the Normandy campaign. The P-47 Thunderbolt gets the credit. The aircraft, the horsepower, The ordnance load. The machines are in the museums. The aircraft are the subjects of scale model kits and documentary footage. The man in the drainage ditch with the clipboard is not in the museum. He was in the operational architecture of the 1990 Tactical Air Command, the critical node. Remove the aircraft, and the controller is harmless. Remove the controller, and the aircraft are blind. The aircraft had the firepower. The controller had the map in his head and the voice on the radio. Neither worked without the other. The radio operators who maintained the SCR-522 sets in conditions the equipment was not designed for. The mechanics who turned aircraft around in 40 minutes because the armored unit was still in contact and needed cover. The targeting officers at forward air direction posts who maintained the frequency schedules and the call sign rotations so that a controller in the field could reach the right flight without a directory. These are the people who made the German officers' experience, that of watching a perfectly prepared defense evaporate in 11 minutes, possible. The aircraft delivered the ordnance. The system aimed it. The system was people. If you find yourself wanting to understand who actually built the machine that made that ridge untenable, the answer is not a name in a headline. It is a list of men whose names did not make the dispatch. If you care about that kind of story, the quiet labor behind the visible result, this channel is exactly where to find it. After the war, a team of American analysts interviewed captured German commanders as part of a systematic effort to understand the campaign from the other side. The project was called the German Military Documents Section, and later, some of that material fed into the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. What the interviews returned, again and again, was a specific answer to the question of what had broken German defensive capacity in France. Not the number of American divisions, not the material superiority of the American logistical system, though that was noted. Not even the quality of American infantry, which German officers consistently described as adequate but not remarkable. The answer was the air coordination. Specifically, the speed of it. One captured general. The account is in the historical record without a specific name in the version available. Described the experience of trying to organize a defense in the Cobra sector as equivalent to trying to dig a trench while someone was filling it in at the same pace you were digging. Every position you prepared was struck before you could use it. Every gun you registered was identified before it could contribute. Every route you reserved for a counterattack was interdicted before the counterattack could move. He did not know about the FAC. He did not know there was a man in a ditch watching his positions and calling coordinates into a radio. He had assumed, as German doctrine would assume, that the Americans were using aerial reconnaissance aircraft to generate targeting data, and that this process took hours. It took minutes, because the reconnaissance was happening at ground level, in real time, by a man with a radio who was already there. The German officer at the farmhouse wall had written in his notes that they knew. He was right. They knew because someone had watched. Someone had counted. Someone had done the mathematics of bearing and distance and attack axis while lying in a ditch. And someone had compressed the time between knowing and striking down to something the German defensive system had no procedure to survive. That is what made it impossible to counter. Not the aircraft. The loop. The ridge is fields now. The gun pits are gone. The farmhouse wall where the German officer stood is gone too, or rebuilt, the way almost everything in Normandy eventually was. The SCR-522 radio sets are in a handful of collections. Some of them are in storage, without being cataloged. Most of the men who carried them are gone. The forward air controllers who served with XIX Tactical Air Command did not, in most cases, receive the recognition given to the pilots they guided. Their names are in unit rosters, in personnel records, in the dry accounting of military administration. A few wrote memoirs. Most did not. What they left behind is a different kind of record. It is in the German after-action reports that describe strikes on positions no aircraft should have been able to find. It is in the interrogation transcripts, where captured officers describe an enemy that seemed to see through walls. It is in the testimony of commanders who had spent careers learning to build defenses and found, in the summer of 1944, that the defense they built in the morning was gone by afternoon. The invisible part of the American air power advantage was not the aircraft. It was the voice on the radio. The man close enough to see what the aircraft could not. The man who took the gap between detection and strike. A gap that, historically, had given defenders time to survive. And closed it. The Germans built the ridge. They dug the pits. They registered the guns. They followed the manual. The manual had not been updated for a man lying in a drainage ditch with a grease pencil map and a radio that almost worked. He was already there when they arrived.